Perfect. Right. So it is going to be recorded, so I can put it on YouTube and places afterwards, just so people can attend or watch it rather if they haven't had time to see it today. It's going to be about 35 to 40 minutes, depending on how long some of the stories take to come out. Then we'll take some questions. We don't really want it to take any more than an hour because I'm actually based in Australia and I've got to get up or I've got to go to work in a little while. So an hour is kind of the limit for the whole thing. So my name, if you don't know much about me, is Mike Mason, and I'm one of the human diver instructors. My background is in military aviation. I did about 20 years in the Royal Air Force, and now I work for the Australian Air Force as a flying instructor. There's another committee. I'm also a pretty passionate diver, as you'd expect, which is why I'm kind of part of this team. I'm very keen on open circuit. I also do quite a lot of rebreather diving, and I work locally for one of the dive shops casually as a dive master, taking people out to see the grey nurse sharks, one of their local sites here. About 4 or 5 years ago, I came across the Human Diver website, and I thought, this is brilliant, because all the human factors and non-technical skills concepts that the human diver is all about, I could really relate to from my experience with flying, which was brilliant. So I joined the team, and here we are today. I just need to make sure that everybody is muted. If you aren't muted, can I please ask you to do so? There might be times when I get you to unmute. Who's the guilty party? I'm just having to shuffle through all that. There we go. I think I found them. Right. Jenny, would you like to introduce yourself to the team, please?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name's Jenny Lord. I'm also one of the human factors instructors. I've been diving since 2008 and an instructor since 2010. And in my past life as an outdoor education instructor, I taught a lot of team building, teamwork, communication, that sort of thing. So when I first encountered the human diver, it really resonated with me, and I could see that a lot of the things that I'd been teaching previously, sure, they fitted in so well with diving, but they were missing. They weren't there, especially when it came to instruction. And I wanted some kind of framework to build this in, and Human Diver's given me that framework. So I've been teaching it now for 3 years, and it's completely changed the way I'm instructing, and also having now taught quite a few students this course as well. I've seen the differences in both their instructing, if they're instructors, but also their diving as well. So I really like getting it out there. And I think the briefing and debriefing side of it is one of the strongest tools we've got. So I'm really excited to share that with you this evening.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jenny. This talk, as I mentioned to some of the people who arrived early on, it's going to be quite interactive. So if you can put your cameras on, that'd be great, because I'm going to ask, that's going to be useful very shortly. And I'm also going to get you to potentially unmute and talk about things, and also use the chat window to, again, talk about some stuff and give us some answers to some questions that we're going to ask you. So the first question that you can see on the slide in front of you: who has ever had something go wrong to them during a dive? Please put your hands up on your screens. Few hands going up, not surprised. Cool, right. Can I please ask those with their hands up to keep their hands up if they're willing to talk about what a story that's happened to them? Let's go with Mark Stiebel. Can you unmute yourself, please, Mark, and tell us about a story that happened to you, and specifically, if you've got any thoughts on some of the causes or that might have contributed to the outcome, and any lessons that you might have learned.
I've got a few stories I could probably bring up.
Yeah.
But one in particular was a dive that I was doing with a friend of mine. Well, I say with a friend, but he was a fisherman, and we were out diving at a local site. He was he was doing some fishing, and I jumped over with a catch bag to get some scallops, and I was dragging behind a rope with a boy behind it, so I could hook my scallop bag onto the rope, and he could follow me around on his boat with my float. And after about 45 minutes of filling up a catch bag full of scallops, I ascended, and to find no float and no boat. And yeah, as it turns out, the float had come detached from my rope at the top of on the surface, and he continued to follow the float, and I continued to follow to drag the rope.
And you both went your separate ways, quite literally.
We both went our separate ways, and he was alerted when his depth sounder showed about 3 meters deep, and he could see the bottom, and he couldn't see me.
Fair enough. Okay. And then I take it you found each other afterwards at some stage?
Yes, I started to make my way back towards shore, and he sort of did a bit of a circular search pattern and ended up finding me.
Okay, so something you talked about there was his kind of clue that you were no longer under the float because at 3 meters he couldn't see you. Did you talk about anything else afterwards that maybe could have been used for future situations like that? More clues that could have identified that you weren't there perhaps a bit sooner?
Looking back, probably not. And we sort of had a bit of a moved past the oh shit moment, and had a bit of a laugh and a joke about it afterwards.
Yeah.
But didn't really debrief on actually how we could have prevented it, and nor really spoke too much about how bad it could have gone wrong.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, cool. And that kind of thing is completely normal. That's very common, especially in the world of diving. Yeah, great. Good story. Thanks for sharing with that, Mark. If you can mute yourself again, please. And we're going to go on to another bit of audience participation.
So these are two very well-known military teams. On the left-hand side of the screen here, we've got the Red Arrows, who are an aerial display team. And the right-hand side is from the SAS. And they're both very, very high-level military teams. What else do they have in common? If you can stick your hands up again, I'll scroll through and see who we come out with. Any ideas?
Or feel free to type something in the chat window if you want, guys. That might be a little bit easier for you. Guys and girls.
Teamwork, yep, that's a good start. They're both very high-performing military teams. High performance, for sure. They are working at the top of their games, both of them. What about in how they work? Any similarities between those? Risks, for sure. They're both facing very, very high risk in their jobs. Chris, yeah, for sure, they need to be efficient. Anybody else? I'll give you a hint. Think about what this presentation is about. There is very little room for error. And how do they make sure they keep that error as little as possible, Shane? Excellent communication, practice experience, and John, yeah, fantastic, of course. Bit of a giveaway here. It's briefing and debriefing. They have to know what they're doing. They have to make sure they've planned everything beforehand, and that they have a briefing at the start of it and then a debriefing at the end of it. But the big question there then is, why do we do this?
So, more audience participation. Why do we have a briefing in the first place? Everybody, please revert back to the chat window and give us some answers. What is the point in having a briefing? What does it achieve? What does it do? Reach the goal, yep. Make sure everyone's on the same page. That's a good one, Kevin. We'll come back to that one shortly. Alignment, that's kind of the same thing, Ahmed. Yep, perfect. Everyone knows what the plan is. You guys have got some good answers here. I like these. Mental model. Anyone think Andres knows what he's talking about? Plan of the dive, yeah. Depth, duration, what to be careful of. Those are some good specific points there, John. Plan B, some redundancies, yep. Everyone understands what's expected of them. Yeah, what the individuals are supposed to do. That comes on to some role clarity stuff, which we'll talk about a bit later. Cool, there's some good answers there. And the make sure everyone is on the same page from Kevin. That sums it up quite well, actually. What a briefing is really trying to do, another way I describe it is improve or maximize the team's shared mental model. Just like what Kevin said there, put everyone on the same page. Because if everybody is on the same page, has the same ideas, knows what's expected of them, then your team's situational awareness of everybody within that team is going to be better. And that's then far more likely to lead to better decisions during the dive when things perhaps might go a little bit awry, and ultimately better outcomes. Here's some points to consider when you are giving a briefing. So the first one, setting the tone. If you start a dive brief with, well, I didn't really want to get out of bed today and it's a bit cold, so it's going to be a bit dark. Should we just go around the pub? People aren't going to be that bothered. But if you've got a bit more life about you and it's like, right, folks, I know it's an early start. I know it was cold, but this wreck is brilliant. There is so much cool stuff to see. That second approach is much more likely to instill a bit of confidence, a bit of positivity, and everyone's going to have a better time. The second point there, establishing norms. That's to do with like standards for the dive. What are you going to do is like normal procedures. So things like no more than 60 minutes under the water, no more than 5 minutes deco. Everybody needs to get back on the surface with 50 bar, that kind of thing. So people know how to make or can make educated decisions during the dive to achieve those kind of, to make sure the norms are stuck to. Now, you might have to put a bit more meat on the bones. So for example, it's common to say, please be back on the surface with 50 bar, and that's fine. And if you're used to doing the same dives, week in, week out, then it'll be quite easy to know what stages you need to be at beforehand to finish with 50 bar on the surface. But if you're going somewhere else, a slightly deeper dive site or a slightly bigger wreck, then you might need a bit more guidance. It's worth highlighting to the team to be back on the surface with 50 bar. You need to be at the bottom of the shot line with 80 bar, for example. And that obviously varies depending on context, team, equipment, etc., etc. The third point there, agreeing outcomes. It should be a kind of set of standard outcomes that at the end of every dive, everybody comes out having had a good time and they feel safe and well from physical and psychological harm. But beyond that, there might be other outcomes that you want to get out of it. Somebody might want to put up a practice putting up a DSMB. If you've got some rebreather divers, they might want to practice a bailout drill, etc., etc. You might have somebody who wants to find a particular type of fish or nudibranch or something. And if you talk about that beforehand in the briefing and get that information out there, then if you see that particular fish, and you know that the other person wants to see it, but they're a bit far away, you're more likely to go and get them and bring them over to show them so that they can actually get more out of the dive and you can achieve all those outcomes.
So the other things that we need to do is encourage assertion, allow people to actually speak up. And one way of doing that is making sure that there isn't a really steep authority gradient. So sure, I might be leading the dive, but that doesn't mean that other people can't speak up with their ideas and the things that they want to do for the dive. And it's really important to set that early on. I'm sure we've all been out with dive masters who are shouting at us and telling us, no, you're going to do that. Well, that's great and that we know what we're going to do, but it means if we actually need to speak up and say something, it can be difficult. The absolute classic is when you get to the end of the briefing and you say, has anyone got any other questions? No? Okay, let's get in. You've just shut that down, that whole conversation down straight away by giving a closed question and not really allowing people to actually answer it properly. Using open questions allows people to actually talk back to you. and give whatever it is that they want from the dive. And that's the same with setting an open atmosphere, allowing people to talk, allowing us to be relaxed and know that, sure, I can put my hand up and I can say, actually, I don't agree with that. But having said that, we do need to establish some authority, because we still need to know who is the actual leader of the dive. And you can still have a leader even with a slightly lower authority gradient. So we need to know who's going to be looking after the deco, for example, or looking after the navigation. And we need to know everybody's job roles. Now, everyone uses different models, and I'd never actually seen one that fully covered everything for briefing. And this one, United, does really, really good job of making sure that we can remember every point that we need to for our briefing. I know I've seen a few other little models that cover things like remembering to add in the time and the depth and stuff like that. And they're great, but this one thinks about the other factors involved. So we've got United. U stands for the understanding of the task, goal, or objective. Like Mike said, there is no point getting into a dive and having competing goals. If you know that somebody's going after that fish and you keep an eye out for it, then that's great. Everyone's had a good dive. So making sure everybody knows everybody else's goals on a dive means we can all help each other rather than be competing against each other. N, notify team of roles. Who is the leader? Who's in charge of looking at the NDLs? Who's in charge of the navigation? It might be that's two different people. If you've got somebody who's familiar with the site, but perhaps they're going to use all of their capacity to look for that. So always know what everyone's job role is. I'm an underwater photographer. I like taking photos, and quite often my role in the team is simply that. It is just as the team photographer. And people need to know that I'm not leading the dive at that point. That's all I'm doing is taking photos. So once we know what everyone's roles is, again, that helps to make it very, very clear so that we don't go to the wrong person or ask the wrong person to make a decision. I stands for identify the resources needed, the risks, dependencies, and threats. So this can be things as simple as, do we have enough gas to do the dive? What about what gas we're on? If you're on nitrox and I'm on air, then things might look a little bit different to us both underwater. So do we have the right gas for the dive? What about other things that we need? Do we need a surface float, for example? Is there a chance that the surface float could get separated from us? In which case, how are we going to deal with that? And the way we do that is by going on to T, or test the plan.
Testing the plan. Thanks, Jenny. Red teaming. What this is all about is picking holes in the plan in a constructive fashion. We call it constructive dissent, where you look at the plan and you say, well, what if that happens there? What are we going to do? What if this happens here? What are we going to do? What if we lose our float on the surface at this time? What are we going to do next? That kind of thing is what you're going to talk about. And it's not to do with making people look stupid or silly. It's things like, what if we run out of gas here? What if the line breaks? What if bodies get separated? And by thinking about those things and trying to pick those holes in the plan may well change. You might be doing a drift dive or a cave dive, and at the start you've decided your turn pressures, when you're going to turn around and come back. But if the current is going to be, if there's a risk of the current being stronger than you expect, you might have to change those pressures or those gas points where you turn around, such that you can still achieve a safe outcome, and therefore redefine those no-go points and limits as well under the same point T. E, establishing emergencies and contingencies. So you've talked about in T, trying to think about things that could go wrong and measures that you might have to prevent them or mitigate errors mitigate things when they do go wrong. But ultimately, you might have to plan for things when they do go wrong that are out of your control. Is your emergency plan valid for the circumstances? Is the medical kit up to date? Is your emergency oxygen cylinder full and definitely working? Is the nearest chamber open and ready? It's quite common for us to make assumptions about that sort of thing, but actually there's a risk that the chamber might be occupied by somebody else, or it might be down for maintenance. And if that happens, the next chamber could be a very long way away. So these kind of things need to be thought about as well, such that, again, you can improve the plan and make it more likely that you're going to achieve good outcomes. The final point there, D, determine the time and place for the debrief. And the idea of that is that by letting people, one more admittance, excuse me, by letting people know that there's going to be a debrief, where and when, then people are likely to make those kind of mental notes about, oh, yeah, I remember that, and I'll bring that up at the debrief later. So that way learning can improve. And that brings us nicely on to debriefing. So why do we have a debrief?
Stick your answers in the chat again, folks. Yeah, reduce risk and enhance the future safety culture. Exactly, Luke. We want to be able to learn. That's the main reason. Opportunity, Andrea, what do you mean by that? What went wrong and why? Brilliant. That's so important. Yeah, what went right as well. What went right, what went wrong, what we can do better. Brilliant. To learn, reflect, learn from the dive, identify future actions. Opportunity to learn from good and bad. Thank you. Brilliant. So most of you are getting that. So reviewing what went well, what didn't, and look at what we can learn. The classic debrief is one like this picture here. This is commonly known as the shit sandwich. And everyone has heard it before. And you sit there and you get the compliment. You go, great, I've got a compliment. Where's the but? Because it's always a but. I like your hat, but your face is ugly. Great, thanks. So as most of you have picked up, we have a debrief because we want to learn from each other. We need to have a shared mental model. So what we need to do is make sure we understand the other person's perspective. What went well for them? Why did it go well? And what went wrong? We don't know what was going on in their heads at the time. So if we can actually share what went wrong and what went well in our own world, then suddenly things start to make sense. And I often say for people coming along on these talks, if you want to know why your friend just did that, whatever that is, and this is exactly how we can find out. It's very simple. We ask them. And yet so many people forget to do that. It is so important because the more we talk about it, the more we can learn and the easier it is. However, it's not as easy as it sounds. First of all, when we're running a debrief, every debrief needs to have a leader. So based on that, what is the role of the person running the debrief?
Cool. Thanks, Jenny. This slide here, talking about the facilitator, that's generally going to be the person who's led the dive, but the person who's definitely going to lead the debrief. And their job is to discover, or sorry, not to discover the things that people didn't do, but what they actually did and how they perceived their world at the time, what made sense to them. It's very common after some kind of incident or bad outcome or whatever, for people to say, well, I wouldn't have done that. You should have done this. You could have done that. Well, that's great, but should have, would have, could have. Those are what we call counterfactuals. And the problem with counterfactuals is they are used to tell a story that didn't happen, which isn't really very much use when it comes to learning. What you need to do is talk to the people, find out what did make sense at the time, which is why they did what they did, and then look to learn and apply on that. It's worth considering here that you can't fix human error. We often think that we can, but it's just not that simple. Humans make mistakes all the time. It's really, really common. It's completely normal behavior. What you can do, though, is actually look to fix the conditions that humans find themselves in so that you can mitigate or avoid the errors appropriately. A simple example would be there's a good chance that human error might lead to buddy pairs getting separated or might lead to you not getting back to the shot line to come up the shot on a wreck. So everybody needs to have a DSMB. Change those conditions so that when human error does occur, you're more likely to achieve a safe outcome. Something else to talk about is to do with perspectives that Harkin mentioned a few minutes ago, different perspectives in the dive.
Exactly. Everybody has a different perspective on life in general, and diving is no different. I've got a story for you about 6 blind people and an elephant. 6 blind people were led into a room and there was this creature in front of them and they were asked to identify it. And the first girl goes up and she happened to be by the ear. So she feels this great big flat piece of what seems like material and said, oh, it's like the sail of a boat. Another guy who's got the tusk said, no, it's like a fence post or something. Another guy who's got the tail said, no, it's more like a brush. The guy that was by the side of the elephant said, no, it's just a wall. If you've got the trunk or if you've got the leg, you've all got a different perspective. And debriefing is about understanding that person's perspective. We can't get a full picture unless we actually get everybody's perspective. So debriefing is vitally important, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about dives or whether we're talking about flying or even in the context of the medical side of things, such as in the operating room.
And that brings us nicely onto this picture here. Thanks, Jenny. This is a guy called Steve Ratcliffe. He is a surgeon based in Seattle, and he did the human diver face-to-face class probably about 4 or 5 years ago now, I guess. And up until the point when he did the class and learned about the debrief model and the extreme usefulness of it, he realized that he'd never actually done a debrief in his operating theatre. So this picture here depicts him and his team running their first debrief after a surgery, which is great. So hooray, it shows that the debrief model is really applicable about learning regardless of the scenario. For me personally, debriefing is just so important. It is such a massive part of what I do. It helps me and those around me get better all the time. Nobody has all the answers, and so by sharing those stories, those lessons, everybody can learn. In my flying role, I want to be the best instructor that I can be, and I've got plenty of other instructors at work who will give me little pointers, hints and tips, things just to keep me on the straight and narrow to make sure that I can be the best instructor I can be. And that way I can help my students be the best pilots they can be as well. As a diving example, probably about 3 or 4 weeks ago now, I was working as a dive master, and I had another assistant dive master called Gary with me, and the viz was relatively poor. And at the end of the dive, we had a debrief, and he talked about how when he was at the back of the group with one of the customers, one of the divers, they had a camera, and because the viz was unusually quite bad, normally people just take pictures of the sharks, and it's great because everybody moves along and takes pictures of the sharks, and the sharks go, and everybody keeps moving. But on this particular dive, because the viz was quite bad and the sharks weren't there to see, this photographer got quite task focused on little things, little nudibranchs or fish that are in amongst the rocks, which is fine. But all it meant was that the group was getting relatively spread out, more than perhaps I was expecting and fully aware of at the time. So now I'm going to take that forward. Gary and I had a conversation about it, and I'm going to take that forward for future dives. So if I have photographers in the group, which I often do, that's absolutely fine. But it's all about managing expectations such that if sharks aren't there or you want to take pictures of the small stuff, well, okay, you can, but you can't necessarily do it to the detriment of the whole group. So that improves that team mental model and just manages expectations and makes the dive better for everyone. Now let's get on to the meat of the presentation. The first letter of debrief, D.
So D stands for define. Define the scope of the debrief and the aims, goals, objectives of the dives, and did we achieve them? So the scope of the debrief is things like where and when are we going to do it? Because we need to know exactly how long it's going to last. And it might sometimes be that actually it's going to be postponed until later on. So if it needs to be postponed, then make sure everybody knows where that's going to be. If you have had a particularly emotional dive, sometimes it isn't appropriate to do it straight away. And it might even be, especially if you're going elsewhere, that you have to do the debrief via WhatsApp or email or Zoom, but it shouldn't be forgotten, no matter how emotional the dive is. It is something that there are things that we can all learn from. So we need to make sure that we know where it's going to be and how long it's going to be as well. I live in Egypt and the water there is lovely and warm. So normally we finish the dive, we stand in the shallow water, and I will be doing the debrief straight away. That won't work in England where I am at the moment, because the dive I did the other day, it was 7 degrees in the water, and when I wanted when I finished the dive, I definitely wanted to get out straight away. So we had to wait for the debrief until we were all warmed up. So it's important that everyone knows when and how long that is going to be. Then looking at the aims of the dive. Did we actually achieve the aims of the dive? And if we didn't, then why didn't we? So this is going back to our briefing. Everyone should have known the aims of the dive. Did they? Because sometimes people weren't listening. So did they know the aims, and were they all reached, or maybe partially reached, or reached for some people and not others? Next up, E.
As the leader, it is crucial and really important that you set an example to get the debrief going. By setting the example of a mistake that you made during the dive or the plan, it just demonstrates to the rest of the team that you're human, that you're fallible, that you're capable of error, which, like we've said already, is completely normal behavior. Now, what that does is it promotes this thing called psychological safety, which is to do with encouraging other people to speak up and talk about their errors as well. Everybody knows that it's safe to actually put their hands up and say, I made a mistake. And what it also can do as well is later on during the debrief, when other people talk about a mistake. So, for example, Jenny might say, yeah, so I did that during the dive, and I might give her a look as the leader and say, really, you did that? But then Tim can turn around and say, do you know what, Mike, you made a mistake too? And I'll be like, oh, yeah, sorry, good point. So it works both ways. It can actually allow people to hold you to account, as well as encouraging other people to speak up. Next letter.
So we've got B, basics. In other words, the pre-jump, the pre-dive. So all of the admin, things like, did we actually jump on time? Quite often we'll be jumping according to a tide time, or we'll having to get onto the boat according to boat schedules. So how did this all go? Did this go to plan? And if not, why not? Was the plan a good plan? Did everybody understand the briefing? So again, back to things like the aims. Were they there? Were they fully understood? And then all the logistics for the dive. Were they all fully understood? And did they work out correctly? Next up, we're looking at the actual dive itself, which is a small r for a reason.
It's a small r because there's not necessarily much learning that occurs here. It's just to do with reviewing the execution, looking at what happened in chronological steps. And the idea is that by just going through things, highlighting those key events step by step, it can just put like a little light or a little ping in people's minds to say, oh yeah, I remember that now. I'll bring that up when it's my turn to speak in the debrief. So like we say, little r, not much learning here, but it does put little cues in people's minds as to those key events, so they can talk about them when they come to their section, which is going to be about now. I.
So the I and the E are the two really super important ones. And during I, you're looking at I, me, myself. We've got 4 questions. What did I do well? We always forget about doing this when we do debriefs. The amount of debriefs I hear that focus on the negative things, but actually there are some things that we do well. And when we do them well, it's really important that we also ask ourselves, why did they go well? Because that will help us to reinforce that behavior and continue it in the future. So what did I do well and why? And then what do I need to improve? So this is looking at things that perhaps didn't go so well, but it might be that it just starts you thinking, because there are always things that we can improve on every single dive. It might be a hard skill, like I need to work on my finning or my buoyancy, but it might also be a human factors skill, like actually my communication wasn't good and I knew at one point that you didn't understand what I was trying to tell you. So, okay, well, how am I going to improve on that? Well, I'm going to think about what hand signs I'm using, or I'm going to slow them down, or next time I'm going to take some wet notes and I'm just going to write in my wet notes. Always thinking about these 4 questions are what really starts to pull the learning out. And this is what the meat of the debrief is spent on. This I and the next E.
So Jenny's talked about I, internal, E is for external. One thing we did well as a team, what did we do well as a team and why? What can we improve on as a team and how? You might just come up with an example of, well, my situation awareness of you was good. Okay, great. Why was it good? Right, well, it was really good because I could see your torch beam in my peripheral vision, and it was constantly nice and stable. And if ever I wanted to know if you were okay, I just put my torch over near your torch, do a little circle for okay, get a quick circle back that you're okay, and we can move on. So what did we do well as a team? Situation awareness of each other was good, but why was it good? Because of that nice disciplined torch use. Conversely, you might be have something like, right, well, we need to improve on this as a team because I was really kind of distracted by what you were doing the whole time. Okay, what was that about? What was the distraction caused by? Well, rather than having this nice disciplined torch beam, like I gave in the first example, the torch beam was often quite erratic and all over the place. So, you know, what was that all about? Oh, right. Well, you know, Chris might well explain to me that I had my torch on the whole time, but I've got a new harness and it was a bit of an awkward fit and I was just kind of jiggling with it quite a bit during the dive. And you can say, oh, okay, well, that's fair enough. But maybe in future, if you're going to manipulate some equipment that's not quite fitting well, just make sure you turn the torch off, albeit briefly, just so that that distraction doesn't occur. Next letter is F.
F stands for follow up or file. And this is for all of the little extra bits that very often do get forgotten about. So things like if we need to write any reports, hopefully we're not having to write incident reports, but sometimes we might be writing learning reports. And that's something for you instructors to think about. If you actually make a few notes about what happened on the dive, it's useful not just for you, but also for the students. When they get a written report at the end of the course as to what happened on every single dive and the thing that they did well and the thing they can improve on, then it means they've got something solid there that they can take away and they can actually strongly consider working on for next time. There are also things like equipment issues. Very often where I live, I'm putting my stages down on the beach, on the sand, and so sand gets inside the regulators. So it's not uncommon to have small leaks by the end of the dive. So when we're doing our F, our follow-up or file, then we're going to look at the equipment and say, oh yeah, Mike, don't forget you had some bubbles coming out of your stage. So you need to just give that regulator a bit of a wash off. So it's just a final check of everything to make sure it is all done, ready for next time.
Okay, so bit of a rattle through those slides. I'm just going to summarize the debrief model and just do a quick recap. First of all, D, defining the aims, the goals and the mission, and making sure that you talk about the timeline for the debrief, which may want to happen straight away if you had a nice successful dive in warm water in Egypt, or perhaps you might want to leave it till you've warmed up in the UK, or even a bit longer if you've had some kind of incident or accident and there's emotions running high. E, really important that people, the leaders, set that example to promote psychological safety for other people to feel comfortable to speak up. B, for basics, everything up to getting in the water. Was the timeline sensible? Did you have the right resources, etc., etc.? R, remember it's a small r for review execution, and that's just because there's no real learning here. It's just to do with highlighting those key events in people's minds so that they can remember to bring them up in their part of the debrief. Which moves on to I, internal. I and E are the really important parts and probably the most difficult parts of the debrief to do properly as well. What went well and why it went well? What can I improve on and how do I fix it? And then, sorry, that's the I part. For the E, what did the team do well and why? And what can the team improve on and how? And those whys and hows are what takes up the vast amount of time in the debrief, and rightfully so, because that's where all the real learning occurs. So how this is generally run is the leader will do D, E, B, R, I, and E. Then everybody else goes and does their I's and E's, and then it comes back to the leader for follow-up or file. What do people need to change their equipment for next dive? Do people need to pass on lessons to an incident report, something quite serious, or just talk to their wider diving organization, maybe put something on social media if it's a story with some lessons in for other people, anything more serious than that as well. Now, as Jenny's already mentioned, sometimes you can be quite rushed for time afterwards, but it's really important to try and get what learning you can out of it. And there are a couple of other debrief models available if you are in a bit of a rush.
So this one is more of a task-focused debrief. It works if you're in a rush. It also works as a slightly easier model, because that debrief model does take a bit of practice to get into. And at first, it might be that you need to have all the points written down. So if you haven't got those and you're thinking, oh, I can't remember what all of the different points were, no worries. You've got this as a backup option as well. So thinking about the actual task that happened, you're basically working your way down the same questions. What went well and why, and what can be improved and how. It's those same questions where we're thinking about building on each other's experiences. Okay, so still with the team, still sharing it all and trying to get that shared mental model, but this one is much more simple. However, it's not always the case that you've got the whole team there or that the whole team want to do a debrief. So you've got this alternate version as well.
A person-focused debrief. This is quite useful for instructors to use at the end of a dive day with their students. And you can just say to your students, right, please tell me one thing I do well. And I might say that to Mark, perhaps my student, and he could say, right, Mike, well, I really like the way that you gave a really thorough briefing for every skill that I had to practice. I knew exactly what I had to do, really good briefing style. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Or I could say to Jenny, can you tell me something I can do more of? And if Jenny was like a brand new open water diver, she might not be as confident as I perhaps think she is. And she could say, do you know what? I'd like you to actually monitor me when I'm assembling my kit a bit more, please, because I'm still not that confident, still getting used to it. Please, can you do some more monitoring when I'm assembling my kit? Yep, absolutely fine. I can do more of that tomorrow. Or perhaps Luke, I might say to Luke, what could I do less of? And Luke might say, do you know what, Mike? I really didn't like the way that every time I was doing a drill, every tiny error, you were instantly kind of jumping in to try and fix it straight away. I found that quite frustrating because I actually prefer to just sort of get on with things, make those little errors, try and fix them myself, and then you to engage at the end. I didn't like the way that you constantly jumped in. And by doing that at the end of day one, with the team of divers that you're about to spend day 2 and day 3 with, you can actually learn and adapt to what those individuals prefer to make day 2 and day 3 much more successful. And as a result, the learning curve, rather than being perhaps relatively flat because those issues are still there, will be much stronger, much steeper, much better, because people are learning at a rate that works for them. So those kind of person-focused debriefs that can be nice and quick can be done fairly effectively. Like Jenny said, if you haven't even got time to do this, you have to rush off, then any kind of feedback via email, text, phone call, whatever, is all still really helpful so people can still learn. Okay, we'll now summarize.
So debriefing is not something that comes particularly easy to most people. It does need a disciplined approach. Things like mentioning that we're going to do a debrief during the briefing helps keep it in the whole team's mind to start with. Also, don't skip the debrief. It's so easy to do. You get out of a dive and you're feeling a bit cold. Oh, I just want to go and get changed. It's not going to be the first thing on your mind. So this is where the whole team can help to hold each other accountable and say, yeah, okay, we're cold, but once we've warmed up, we're going to meet back here in half an hour and we're going to do our debrief. So you need that disciplined approach in order to keep doing it and to keep practicing it, because it needs that practice. The more you do it, the easier it gets, and the more you start to understand how to pull out the important information. The important questions are why and how. What went well and why? What can we improve and how? It's no good just saying that. The why and the how are where most of the learning comes from. So practicing it and listening to people and trying to pull those things out are what's going to help us.
And within that, Jenny, I had a conversation with somebody from BSAC a couple of days ago, and they were talking about how they found the debrief model quite awkward to use, and they preferred to use BSAC's REAP model, which on paper is actually kind of the same thing. So that leads us into point 3, requiring a behavioral change. If you're used to using something and someone says, well, why don't you try this one? Oh, don't like it, it's different, I'm used to doing this is what I want to stick with. Well, that's kind of fine. And don't get me wrong, REAP is not a bad model at all. I think Debrief probably has a few more avenues to really dig into the learning, but they're actually quite similar. And just getting that behavioral change can be quite difficult. We are creatures of habit. And within debriefing as well, another behavioral change aspect to consider is we're not used to being criticized. It's not particularly common in most walks of life. And then when people give us feedback, that can come across as being critical, potentially insulting, and that's not what we need. So it's important that we try and do everything we can to take that feedback on board constructively, positively, so that we can improve. And that requires effective communication skills on the part of the person giving the feedback, running the debrief. It's important that you frame the feedback appropriately so that people don't get put on the back foot and don't feel insulted. A way to consider this is don't make the feedback about the person themselves, make it about what they've done, about their behavior. Try and separate those two. It makes it much more easy to digest. Keywords that you can use when you're talking to people, asking them questions during the debrief are how and what rather than why. So what I mean is you could say, how did it make sense to do that? Or what made you do this? If you say, why did you do that? That is likely to promote defensive behavior, put people on the back foot, make them feel like they have to defend themselves, and therefore it instantly puts up those barriers and learning is a bit more limited. Communication is a real art form in itself, a whole subject that we teach at the Human Diver, and there's an awful lot to it. It's not simple. This whole thing takes practice and effort to try to get used to get better. But remember, it's all about learning and improvement for everybody, the person running the debrief and the people in the team themselves. Because that last point there, this is all about improving the team's situational awareness for future dives. You have a debrief, you learn some lessons, that improves the situational awareness, the mental model for future dives, which are then fed into future debriefs after those dives, and so on and so forth. And the process gets better and everybody keeps learning, everybody keeps improving. That's what this is all about. Great. That is us just about done. I'm going to put a link in the chat to the debrief model for the Human Diver so people can have a look at that in their own time. And we'll take some questions. So feel free to type any questions in the chat window. We've got some time.
There's a great note there from Jim. Thanks. Yeah, it's really important to think about the good things because they so often do get forgotten. So don't forget those positives. Thanks, Gareth.
There's the link to humandiver.com debrief model. Feel free to have a look at that, folks. You're welcome, Grace. Thanks, Pete. More than welcome, everyone. Question from Mark. Right, Mark's question. When I'm DMing on a rec tour for my shark dives, do I debrief with the entire group or just my team? If I can, I will debrief with the entire group. It tends to be, as you can imagine with customers, a relatively person-focused debrief. What did I do well? What can I improve on? What can I do more of? What can I do less of? The boat itself is often a bit of a rush. It's very noisy. We get out of the water. The service interval is all about changing tanks over, getting people some food. As soon as we're done with the second dive and we're back to the marina, the engines are running and nobody can hear themselves think half the time. It's not the best boat. However, if there is anything that I think is worth highlighting. If somebody's trim is quite poor or they're getting through a lot of gas, then I will talk to that person and offer them feedback, thoughts for future dives to try and help improve their diving. But I certainly always encourage feedback for me as well. Yes, and I'll do that I'll do that kind of with the group, and I will try and pester people as well afterwards via phone or email if it's appropriate. A lot of the time people aren't that bothered, they just want to get on with their day. Okay, fine. But I have had people come up to me and say, actually, do you know what, I felt that the dive was a little bit rushed there, I wanted to spend a bit more time looking at that. Okay, fine. And I take those points on board and take them forward. But yes, if I've got any other if you like dive professionals with me, other dive masters, then I will certainly find those guys to talk to. Yes, so I do debrief with the entire group if I can, albeit it tends to be a bit, please give me feedback if you've got it, and then I will talk to the other people in the team or if you like the dive professional team to try and get some more some better information. Thanks. Does that answer your question, Mark?
That also is very similar to Andre's question as well.
Yep.
If you've got a group of let's say more than 8 divers, quite often if I'm diving with a big group, then we'll sit down afterwards to have a drink anyway. And when we're sat down, then I'll use the much more informal debrief model. So I'll just tend to go around, right, okay, what was good about that dive then, guys? What did you enjoy? So they can actually throw it out, and then it's all right, but you know, what were you really proud of on that dive? And the amount of times you get the new divers that go, oh, I could control my buoyancy for the first time. Brilliant. That's great to know. So hopefully then they remember that for next time. And then you can quite often from there lead into, so what are we going to change for next time? Or what do you want me to change for next time? And that's a really informal way of doing a debrief that's a lot more relaxed than that kind of formal going through the full debrief model.
Cool. Laura's question, teaching entry-level skills. Yes, there are definitely going to be skills that are relatively new. And I'd like to go through each skill, a bit light on the D&E, and then repeat the middle part over for each skill and each student. What went well, it needs to be improved next time. So I'm looping this middle part over and over. I guess for that kind of thing, Laura, that's quite a instructor to student relationship. When we're talking, the debrief model is perhaps more applicable for diving on a kind of peer level where everybody is, let's call it the same. I'd suggest with the context that you're talking about there, when you're actually teaching people new skills, yeah, definitely in that kind of environment, while you might skip over the D&E perhaps a bit more quickly, it's still important to try and focus on the middle bits and specific points a bit more over and over to try and reinforce those skills.
I'm going to contradict you slightly there, Mike.
Oh, go on.
Because I quite often I do quite a lot of instructing. I actually go quite heavy on the E.
Okay.
Because the amount of instructors who can't admit to their own failings, and then that starts to set up that high authority gradient. So I will try and come out with something that, you know, for sure, even if I haven't made anything particularly obvious on that dive, then I'll share other mistakes that I've made to try and help lower that authority gradient and show them that it is okay to share any mistakes they made. And I find that then it starts to come easier and they will start to admit far more. So yeah, I will still stick on the example. And then, as you've said, Laura, yeah, repeat the I and the E, especially the I, over and over. So that they can pull out everything that they think they did well. And it might be that some of the skills actually don't really need much discussion because they thought they did it well. I also thought they did it well, so I don't have any points to add to them. So great, that went well. Why did it go well? Awesome, next one. And, you know, then we don't have to talk about it a lot. Or it might be, well, that went well for the first time because they've been really struggling on that. And then we might dig into it a little bit more. So yeah, looping that middle part works.
Cool. Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, I think that's super. You're right. It's super important to set the example as the leader in any context to encourage that psychological safety. Thanks, Laura.
Rafal, for your question, how do you know if a dive centre uses or is familiar with it? The only way you know is if the instructor normally has taken the course. That's the only time you're going to find out. And I know for me, I do try and look out for instructors that have done it, because then I know that they're likely to follow something like this. But other than that, just ask them and see what they follow.
Jalene's point there is a good one. I work at a university that has a dive minor, and at the end of the semester, students fill out an evaluation on each dive master and instructor, and that's really really useful as well. And that kind of can be a good introduction to, or a good way of getting that feedback without risking any kind of confrontation. So the debrief model, like Jenny talked about at the early phase of the summary slide, it does take a bit of effort to make it work, and it takes a bit of practice to do it properly, and it takes effective communication skills to try and break down those defensive barriers. But if you've got a evaluation form where people are a bit more separated, then that will perhaps naturally make them more willing to offer some feedback that may be considered a bit harsh. So the feedback gets across. It's not perfect, and you don't have a conversation about things, but it's certainly better than nothing, and a good way of getting information across. Thanks, Gillian. Any more questions?
Questions?
Well, that's almost perfect. We're almost at 8 o'clock, which means I've got time just to have a cup of tea before I go to work. Great. Thanks, everyone. I will stop the screen share, and I'll stop